My name is Kevin Timson. I lead the business transactions team at Bellavia Blatt. We are a law firm based in New York. We work nationally, and we've been in the business of serving dealerships for the past 30 years. We focus only on serving dealerships. We don't work with manufacturers. We have a small business, impacting other industries, but our primary focus and 90% of what we do is work with dealerships, and we work with dealers and everyone who works for them, like yourself. So we're a full-service firm. We handle warranty parts reimbursement. So if I was talking about that, I'd probably go into more numbers similar to Brett. We also focus on business transactions, obviously, as well as manufacturer disputes and dealer litigation. Litigation actually we've been pretty prominent on that nationally. Our senior partner, Len Bellavia, has been on some of the leading cases in the past several years, including the litigation related to the Chrysler dealerships that were terminated during the Chrysler bankruptcy. That started about 10 years ago, and it's still going on. We've been very fortunate to put that together. I focus, as I said, every day on buy-sell transactions across the country in every shape and form. And when Sam had asked me to come today, I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about all those things, all the really small little things that you don't always think about because you're busy running your dealership, all those things that could really not scuttle the deal, but delay it, add time, add cost. Very often when we're working with other attorneys on the other side of the deal, some of these attorneys have business transaction experience, some of them just have real estate transaction experience, but many of them may or may not have experience in selling or buying or helping clients buy motor vehicle dealerships. And so it's really important, hopefully, that you can take away some of these factors to consider should you work on a deal, and should you have an opportunity to help provide additional context to your attorneys as well. Okay, so there are a couple of things that we're going to go through today. First and foremost is we're going to talk about presale assessments. Okay, so what does that mean exactly? Presale assessment means before you look to sell your dealership, before you look to purchase a dealership, there are going to be things that you're going to have to consider, particularly about that store's situation. All right, and for a seller in particular, that's going to provide you with the kind of expectations that will realistically help you negotiate. Okay, so once again, what does that really mean? The better terms, the better your dealership's position is in terms of sales and operation and success, the better terms you will get, and vice versa. Now that sounds obvious, but in my experience, I've worked with a lot of dealers who are selling their dealerships, and there's a lot of emotional investment in that, and sometimes that can get in the way of honestly assessing how your dealership might be sold and under what terms. So let's start off with really some of the best terms. Okay, so I kind of call that leaving on a high note, right? So you have a great dealership, it's a great location, it's a great brand, you do service and sales, you have new car sales, you have used car sales, everything's going great, you have a fantastic management team, you have enough techs that are well supported. Very often, those are dealerships that might be subject to a sale because, quite frankly, there are people willing to purchase them, particularly private equity firms and family offices, other types of financial buyers. So that's a great situation. There might be some situations that provide additional limitations, such as you have a family business. Maybe it's not working that well. It worked for 50 years. You have a lot of people from the family who are working in the business who may not be ready to leave. Okay, so there's a lot of additional constraints that are presented on that. And maybe, for instance, you are a first generation or second generation owner and the next generation doesn't want to participate in the business. And so there's a timeline because you want to go and retire, you want to, while you're still healthy, while you still have enough energy and life in you to basically hand it off to someone if it's not your next generation. Very often the business itself is not working very well. It's a bad location, there's a lot of competition, maybe from a dealer up the interstate. The managers or staff are either not that very good, or they have left, or they've mismanaged the dealership and you weren't aware of it and you're trying to recover a good position as an owner. Okay, there could be factory issues. Maybe you're not meeting their sales objectives. Okay, maybe you're not meeting the request for a facility upgrade or things like that. Maybe they want to close the point. Maybe they want to move on to move the dealership to another point. So whatever those factors are, really take a deep dive and understand exactly what's going to control your fate before you start deciding to make terms or set terms. Okay, let's also talk about alternatives to selling. Do you need to sell your business, or are you looking to get additional capital that's going to help improve that store because right now you feel it's unsustainable without an additional influx of capital, or maybe support some of your other stores or other businesses? So that could take shape in the form of buy-ins, where you have a financial investor that takes a minority or a majority position in the dealership. It could relate to refinancing, depending upon what your floor plan provider has already taken in terms of collateral and position. And it can also refer to things like the sale and leaseback of real property. Many dealers own the property that they operate the dealership under, and very often you'll have consultants who will come in and organize a transaction where they will sell, the store owner will sell the property to another entity and then lease it back. So you get to extract significant value from that transaction while being able to set up a long-term lease. Okay, so another thing you might be looking at is you just want to plain exit the business and retire. Okay, so that's where succession planning comes into effect, and certainly talking with a firm like Brady Ware and attorneys who work in estate planning and succession planning helps. Also, I know this is probably mentioned by the folks at Brady Ware, employee stock ownership plans and programs. That's another way to transition your exit out of the business. Okay, so the exit doesn't always have to be from a buy-sell. Okay, last but not least, how are you going to find buyers? This sometimes becomes an issue that is kind of looked over. Very often, it'll start with the assumption that you can just talk to someone who you know. Maybe Fred has a Toyota dealership down the road, and you're trying to sell a Chevrolet dealership, so you think there might be a friendly deal. Well, it might start out friendly, but sometimes it doesn't always end friendly. In addition, you put yourself at risk of keeping the terms of the deal secret, because that's something you always want to focus on, because if word gets out and your key sales managers or your key techs or whomever find out and they're not really comfortable with the new buyer, that puts their tenure there at risk for you, and that's obviously not a great situation. Another option would be talking with your OEM, all right, talking with the factory. That certainly has advantages in terms of getting a wider net of buyers potentially. The two drawbacks, I should say, are number one, there isn't always a guarantee that the terms will be kept confidential as well. For some reason, zone managers have reportedly like to talk and discuss potential transactions that are out there in the marketplace. In addition, you hand over a lot more control to the factories. All of a sudden, they want to get their folks in there, and you lose some control over the deal. All right, using a broker, depending upon the broker, obviously there's lots of different brokers out there, and there are some advantages there. They can do evaluation. They can set up the marketing plan for how they're going to pitch your dealership to potential buyers, and they can identify buyers just like an OEM would. Obviously, the one drawback is the commission, right? So you're thinking 4 to 8% of any purchase price. So really the question then becomes, for that 4 or 8%, do you think you can get the additional lift in terms of the purchase price that makes up for that? Okay, so at a certain point you decide that you're interested in pursuing the sale of your dealership. Okay, so very often we have clients who come to us and say, I have a term sheet. Or I get a call from a broker that says, we have a term sheet. And my first question is, well, what is this term sheet? Can you send it to me? And who wrote it? Very often it's a bunch of notes stenciled out on a piece of paper. Sometimes it's typed up. At worst, it is typed up and there's a line there that you have signed and the buyer has signed, which is not good. Really, the term sheet itself is just typically a bunch of terms that can change, right? Because your assumptions start at one point. You're saying, I'm willing to do this for this price. I'm willing to sell this or here. I'm willing to take on seller financing. But obviously, things might change okay, whether you're a seller or a buyer, based upon what information you get later, okay? And most importantly, it's if you sign this term sheet, it becomes part of the agreement. So you really, really want to avoid that. I can't state that any more clearly. Often the terms are unclear. So we'll get a term that says $3 million for the store. What does that mean exactly? Does that mean $3 million for the blue sky value of the store? Does that mean you're including the fixtures and equipment there? Are you including inventory, parts maybe, a part of that? Who knows? You know, very often when you actually have to go back and recollect with the other party as to what that meant, they might come up with a different interpretation and you're nowhere further along than when you started. So my suggestion is to work with an attorney and really get a letter of intent, okay? If your goal is to move the deal forward, okay, maybe there's some things that you still have to figure out, but you want to put a good faith effort to just keep the ball rolling, get a letter of intent, okay? You're going to have a document that gives you just that. It gives you intent. Doesn't mean commitment. And your attorney will probably put in provisions that say, these terms are not binding, okay? It's subject to a final agreement, which shall be binding. And then, most importantly, the amount of information that you put in there is really important, okay? You want to put in the terms that you have agreed to at whatever meeting you have. That's all that you really want to do. Keep it simple, okay? If you begin to put in terms that have not been discussed with the other side or that have not been agreed to, and they see it for the first time in the letter of intent, that could potentially delay the deal or scuttle it altogether. Okay, so let's talk about drafting the purchase agreement. There are two types of purchase agreements. One is an asset purchase agreement, one's a share purchase agreement. So asset purchase agreements are typical for most dealership buy-sells. And so the buyer is purchasing the intangible value of the dealership, the goodwill, the blue sky, but it's also purchasing the hard assets, right? So it's purchasing new vehicles, demonstrators, loaners, used vehicles, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, and special tools, right? So buyers like asset purchase agreements, and they'll always want to take those on unless there's a specific reason not to. And usually the advantages of doing an asset purchase agreement are obvious because you're buying the assets, but you're not taking on the liabilities of the seller's company, okay? So that is pretty important, and as counsel to most buyers, I would recommend using an asset purchase agreement rather than a share purchase agreement. The only thing you have to really worry about as a buyer then is, are you going to take over any assumed contracts, and what reassurances do you have in the document that you are going to take possession of those assets free and clear of any liens, okay? Some deals require more than a share purchase agreement when the seller needs to stay at the dealership after the sale, okay? And that comes in many different flavors. Very often there are financial buyers, right? So I mentioned the example of a well-performing dealership, and you might have someone or some organization comes in, wants to buy the dealership and says, you know what, I like your performance, I want to keep you in there, I want to keep your people in there, I want to make sure your people don't leave so that you can continue to maintain that performance. And that's really important to then set up the situation where you're basically taking the assets of the dealership, putting it into a new LLC or S corporation or what have you that has those assets, and then basically having the seller retain, say, a 10%, 15% share of that LLC's ownership interest, enough so that they can remain as dealer principal. All right, and the rest becomes the ownership of the buyer. And so that's key for those buyers, especially financial buyers, but some strategic buyers as well, because most of those buyers are looking to build a network of dealerships, and this is not the only deal that they're going to do. So very often you're going to have various factories and lenders who are involved in every deal that they do. And if they don't get performance from your dealership, then it puts their other future deals at risk. So it's important that they keep you in the dealership as the owner, as the dealer principal, in order to keep that performance going so that they can take on additional deals. In addition, you might have a situation where a buyer is looking to purchase the assets of the dealership and just take the dealership whole, but they got rejected by the factory. Maybe the person who's going to be the dealer principal has a lot of financial assets and has the wherewithal, but they don't have the experience of running a new franchise vehicle dealership. Maybe it's someone who's a used car dealer who's successful. Maybe it's someone who has a motorsports dealership or a trucking dealership, you name it. Okay, so the opportunity there then is to present a structure of a transaction that has a share purchase agreement, okay, and the seller, once again, retains 15% ownership interest, enough to be the dealer principal, but remains on as dealer principal for 24 months, 36 months, so that the buyer can then run the dealership under a management agreement and give enough history to the franchisor so that they can approve that buyer as the new dealer principal eventually. So you have to work on contingency plans and exit plans, but it's another reason why you might want to use a share purchase agreement. Okay, let's talk about specific asset terms. New vehicle inventory. This is probably the one section in every purchase agreement that gets negotiated and looked over the most from most dealers, because this is, I mean, they know this is their territory, and I've learned a lot from the dealers I've worked with, and depending upon the brand, there might be issues that come up or don't come up. Okay, so the price though is more than just about invoice minus holdback, right? So we always say, well, we'll do invoice minus holdback for the sale of the new vehicles. In the plus column, you want to add things like accessories and equipment that gets added. You also want to deduct from the price of those vehicles any incentives that the seller got from the factory, right? And so incentives, if you just put in the agreement, you say incentives, deduct any incentives. It's a pretty broad term, it's pretty ambiguous. You really want to get specific. So if you're a GM dealer, you're going to put in, I think it's IMI and all those other special programs that have certain names that GM recognizes, okay? Because at the end of the day, when you're going to calculate those prices at closing, you want to make sure it's crystal clear what exactly you're deducting. Advertising credits. Those are things that are typically negotiated pretty heavily as well. So, the dealer will get credits per vehicle, all right? And once you sell those vehicles, do those credits come with the vehicle, right? So the seller's going to say, well, I've used that money already to try to sell those vehicles. And the buyer's going to say, well, I want to use that money basically to sell those vehicles that I'm now purchasing. Very often they split the baby, but it's something to be considered and thought about before you enter into this agreement. Last but not least, you have things like floor plan credits. This isn't always obvious right at the get-go when you're looking to negotiate any deductions from the new vehicles. The real indicator, I think, and in terms of what's reasonable, is how long have these new vehicles been on the lot? Okay, so if they've been on a short amount of time, then maybe it's better that the buyer gets a greater share of those floor plan credits. But if they've been on the lot for a while, the seller has a good reason maybe to keep some of that. Okay, and also, most importantly, with new vehicle inventory, please make sure in the agreement that you make sure that you do not get any punched vehicles. I know that people don't think about that, but if there have been situations with some unscrupulous sellers who have sold punched vehicles and it wasn't stated in the agreement and they relied upon that. Now, obviously, you can work around that, but it's better to identify that right in the language of the contract rather than have to deal with that post-closing. Demos. So that's something else that's negotiated in the agreement. Obviously the mileage limits and the price per mile, 25 cents, 35 cents, 50 cents. It's something that you really need to do. What you really need to do is look at the inventory first. There's usually not a lot of demos out there, so it's easy to pull up for the seller and you can say, okay, how many are there? What's their condition? What's their model? What's the model year? And then you can really agree ahead of time as to what you're going to take. That is my recommendation with demos. And once again, it should be a small enough list to go over. And it's something that you can easily get through if you handle it that way. Loaners. This is something that needs to be handled dependent upon the dealership and the brand and how you want to use those loaners for marketing purposes. I have a dealer who was selling a Honda dealership, and he said he had 30 loaners. And the buyer said, I don't need 30 loaners, but the buyer was never a Honda dealer and wasn't really aware that that one location had a lot of service work, and there was a really big need for 30 vehicles, and so there was a negotiation that the buyer accepted most of those vehicles. But it's important for the seller to kind of make that case and establish that if there's a need there. Otherwise, the buyer's going to want to cap that amount, right? Because there's incentive to purchase your own loaners in terms of meeting your sales figures with many factories. So just something to be aware of. Okay. And once again, with loaners, you want to think about the conditional loaners, what the mileage is. You want to be able, as a buyer, to identify that, how many loaners they have, and you want to check the model year as well. So, let's talk about used vehicles. Usually, used vehicles are not included in a given deal, and my advice is really just to keep used vehicles subject to mutual understanding. Keep that provision as simple as possible. You're basically saying, okay, there's going to be at a certain point a review between the buyer and the seller. We're going to list out all the vehicles. We're going to list their price. There's going to be an inspection. And either we agree to a price, and if we don't agree to a price, the seller takes those vehicles. It's probably the easiest thing because the buyers don't want to take those vehicles at the wrong price, and the sellers can just take them, and if they have other dealerships, they can move them to other dealerships, or they can just wholesale them. Special tools. Oh, let's talk about parts and accessories. Parts and accessories, basically, it's usually pretty clear cut. As a buyer, you want to have terms in the agreement that state that you're only taking things that are returnable, right? So you have to use terms like, taking all new inventory that is in its original packaging, unopened, and not obsolete. If you're a buyer, you also might want to focus on fast-moving inventory. So typically that's defined as inventory that has been sold in the past 12 months. Sometimes as a seller, you might be able to push back on that and say, hey, even though hasn't been sold in 12 months, it's still necessary because occasionally we get work that requires those parts. Don't forget about terms specifically for non-OEM parts. Usually the focus is on parts that the factory provides to you, but there might be parts like tires and other things that are kind of generic equipment or parts or accessories, and that's something that, especially as a seller, you probably don't want to hang on to unless you have a place to bring it to, like another dealership, as well as shop supplies. Used vehicles we talked about. Last but not least, let's talk about special tools. That sometimes gets ignored, and special tools are obviously things that are necessary in the factory's mind in order to do warranty work. Sometimes it's lumped in with furnitures and fixed equipment, and there's like some number that's put out there for that whole amount, like $50,000 or $20,000. But if you look at some of the special tools that might be required and the equipment that might be required, it might go well over that amount. And so you really, as a seller, you want to get the value of whatever those tools are. And it's also important from the buyer standpoint, either that you get all the tools that you need, or you get a list from the buyer, from the seller, of what tools are missing. Okay, so you have to get an understanding both from the seller as well as the factory as to what tools you're going to need moving forward from day one. Representations and warranties. Okay, the dealer who is purchasing the dealership is going to be spending a lot of money, mostly in blue sky value. They want to make sure they're getting a good deal. The thing that's really interesting about this industry is that there's not a lot of due diligence done before you sign the asset purchase agreement. I've worked on a lot of deals in different industries, and due diligence before you even sign a contract can take weeks or months. But for some reason, it doesn't happen. It's a much smaller industry. People know each other and trust each other. But that still makes things like representations and warranties from the seller important, because if you're not going to have due diligence, you want to have specific statements that ensure that you're getting what you requested. Okay, so you would put in things like related to facility or franchise deficiencies. Okay, has the seller received notice that there have been sales deficiencies before, or that there have been service deficiencies, or has he received notice that there's a need for a facility upgrade? Okay, those are obvious things that you want you might hear about, but it's better to put it in the agreement to make sure that that if something comes up and it's a big issue and you aren't aware of it, that it can be addressed. Also, the seller will not wholesale vehicles beyond the ordinary course of business. Okay, so what does that mean? So if the seller is typically wholesaling, 5 vehicles a month, and all of a sudden, between the time they sign the contract and the time we have closing, they start to wholesale 50 vehicles a month or what have you. You're basically left as a buyer with a depleted inventory. So you really want to have that protection and put in terms within the representations and warranties that help to guarantee that. The store is open. Store operations don't change after you sign the purchase agreement. Okay, the buyers obviously need that to happen because they want to have a viable business handed to them. They don't want a flailing business that won't be working, that they have to resuscitate. Okay, so you're going to keep normal hours. Okay, if you have weekend hours or if you have evening hours, you keep those hours. Okay, if you have certain profit levels for selling vehicles, you maintain those profit levels rather than either increasing them significantly or decreasing them. All right, vehicle swapping. Very often buyers don't want to have vehicle swapping of inventory unless they get back equivalent models that have equivalent options packages. Okay, so if you're giving away, an Equinox LTZ in midnight blue with a sunroof and leather seats, you want to basically get that back. Another situation we've seen, and it doesn't happen very often, but it happens with unscrupulous sellers, is they know they're leaving. They're going to get some hard to find models, okay, at their dealership, and they're going to give it to a bunch of friends. Maybe they owe some people, something, or owe them a favor or whatever, and they're going to give them a great deal, either at cost or below cost, or not below cost, but at cost or a little above cost. And so they'll take the deposit, and then day of closing, when all those purchase orders are brought over, the buyer looks at this and says, why am I selling this high-end Corvette at cost? It's happened. It doesn't always happen, but you want to at least have some kind of representation in there that those kinds of situations aren't going to occur. This industry is always interesting. So last but not least, WEOs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term. Basically, if a dealer has free oil changes for life for every new vehicle sold, as a buyer, you want to know about that. And you want to know, how many people has that been offered to, what's the potential liability in terms of cost, and you want to have the seller indemnify you for any costs of having to meet that. Okay, now obviously the buyer's not required to meet that because it's a new dealership, but from a goodwill standpoint, you want to keep doing that. We've also had some sellers say, hey, you know what, we're not going to indemnify you, we're just going to have them come over 15 miles away to our other store. Usually the buyers will say, no, that's okay. We'll be settled with the indemnification and we'll handle it. Okay, with buyers, the sellers are going to want to have representations. One important one that says the buyer knows of no reason why they will get rejected. Okay, so from the franchisor. So if that kind of keeps things honest in terms of saying, okay, if there are issues with some owners who might have had felonies or bankruptcies or something that's going to trigger a rejection, that puts it out on the table, and that enables the seller to terminate the agreement and keep the deposit. Restrictive covenants. This usually comes into play, particularly when you have a seller who has other stores, or they may go out and invest in other stores that are nearby, particularly if there are the same brands that you're selling to the buyer. The buyer, for instance, if you're selling a Ford store and the buyer knows that you have other Ford stores in the vicinity, or maybe that there might be some open points coming up soon, you're going to want, as a buyer, to have non-compete covenants and non-solicitation covenants in place. Okay, typically with a non-compete, it's based upon time, it's based upon distance. So time is typically 24 months. Distance can be 10 to 50 miles, but it's really dependent upon the market area. Okay, what market area do you necessarily serve? And you want to limit the geography to that exact market area. So, I live on Long Island, our office is on Long Island, and we had a dealer who was selling on the North Shore of Long Island. And the North Shore, for those of you who are aware of it, has the Long Island Sound, right, north of it, and then north of that is Connecticut. So if you set up a 25-mile radius or a 30-mile radius, okay, that radius is going to cover parts of Connecticut. Okay, now it's pretty unreasonable for the buyer to suggest that the seller can't set up in Connecticut, because that's really not part of the market area for these North Shore dealerships. So it's just something that you need to think about and go through. There might be other challenges as well. We had dealers in Vermont who are up against Lake Champlain, and obviously there are parts of New York that are not going to be part of that contiguous market area. Another thing about non-competes, are you going to limit that to the same brand or to all brands? Well, that depends, right? If the seller has other dealerships that have comparable brands, maybe not the same brand, but if you're talking Toyota versus Honda or Chevy versus Ford, you're going to want to include those other brands. Another thing is, who is actually bound to the non-compete? Is it just the dealer principal? Is it all the other owners? Is it the owners' families? Is it the general manager? Depending upon what you see in terms of the situation with the seller, you may want to add these additional individuals. Okay, and last but not least, what is competition? Is it ownership in another dealership? Is it employment? Is it consultation? In the past, we've seen sellers sell their business and then go work as a general manager at a same brand store. That doesn't really happen as much anymore, but sometimes folks will want to put that idea in place. Non-solicitation based upon time, distance, and parties. Okay, so once again, time is 2 years. Distance can be similar to the non-compete. Parties are typically, soliciting employees and customers. We've heard about the importance of keeping your employees from the last presentation. So what is reasonable with employees? It could be limited to solicitation to employees that are hired by the buyer, to those that were quit from the buyer. So maybe someone started working for the buyer and said, hey, I don't want to deal with this. I'm just going to go work for the guy who I worked with before. That's not really fair to the buyer. Maybe if they were fired, it'd be different because the buyer doesn't want them. But it's something you can add to the language. The buyer might want to include broad limitations on key employees and managers. Maybe you have certain experienced techs. Maybe you have the sales manager and the general manager who you absolutely want to keep. And the seller should not look at those individuals or breathe upon them or hire them or solicit directly or indirectly. So that's something to think about. Also, the seller might want to create exceptions for their people, right? Because obviously there's folks who have been loyal to that dealer, and the dealer knows that and probably wants to help them in other businesses that they own. So that can be arranged as well. Real property terms, the basic takeaway here is really that you want to take adequate time for the sale or leasing of real property. There's so much of a focus on these deals with the sale of the dealership itself that it becomes almost an afterthought when you actually have to craft and close on the sale of the real property or the leasing. Okay, so with the sale, usually the sale is more money than the value of the dealership, often, at least in terms of what we've seen. If you're the seller, at a certain point you might have come up with a number, and maybe there's a lot of negotiation back and forth. You should really consider, all right, do we maybe then do a lease, a long-term lease, basically, where I continue to be a landlord, rather than accept a price I don't want, all right? Or, do I set up a lease because I expect the neighborhood to improve and I want to be able to capture that value. I've seen that with a lot of dealerships that I've worked with. In terms of time, the title issues themselves, working with a title company that's going to take as long as a factory approval. So from the time you sign the dealership agreement, you're going to want to start identifying who you're going to use as a title company, getting whatever information they have, so that you can figure out, well, what exceptions need to be carved out of this policy. What am I going to cover as a seller? What is the buyer going to cover? All right. When you close on the sale, you're going to want to have the signatories for both parties all in the same location. Very often we can do kind of virtual closings, and I do that out of state as well. But at the very least, I want to have all the people who have to sign in the same room so that we can get originals, and the title closer can go in, take those originals for the deed, for tax documents, and submit them to the county clerk's office. When it comes to leasing from the seller, okay, there's a couple of things to consider. Very often, if I'm representing the seller and they paid $25,000 a month to a real property company that they own, right? So if the seller owns the property and they had an operating company that ran the dealership, the operating company paid $25,000. Now, maybe that agreement started 15, 20 years ago, and that amount never got adjusted. But it's always important to not leave money on the table and to understand, well, what really is the market rate here? Because even if you don't give that market rate to the buyer, you still get additional leverage in terms of other aspects of the deal. And it's always important to realize that the lease itself or the sale of property is part of that overall deal. So if you're having issues with the asset purchase agreement, you can make concessions either in the rent or in the sale terms for the property. When it comes to third-party landlord consents, I give out these warnings to clients at the beginning of every deal, and sometimes they follow it and sometimes they don't. It's always important to let your landlord know as soon as you sign an agreement for the sale of the dealership. Very often, dealers are hesitant because they don't want to let everybody know about the deal, and they don't want the landlord getting scared, because if the buyer doesn't get approved, then maybe they're worried that they're not going to be able to stay very long or something like that, or not going to get a renewal for a term that's expiring pretty soon. But it comes at a cost if you delay, and the cost can be delaying closing, right? So you have everything lined up, you have the franchise approval lined up, and in some situations I found that the seller is still chasing the landlord to get approval for an assignment, or the buyer is still chasing the landlord to get a new lease approved. Leasing from the seller for interim purposes. Usually that happens when the buyer knows they're going to relocate the property, okay? And so there's a little uncertainty as to when that's going to happen. They might have to build on that new property. They have to identify it. So you might have a lease that's interim that lasts for 3 years, 5 years, whatever, okay? Both sides should really treat that lease as if it's a long-term lease, because the issue becomes, if you don't relocate to that new property or you don't build that building, what's your plan B? More than likely your plan B is you're going to stay at that location, and then so all the issues that you didn't really care about because you thought you were going to be out of there will come up to rear their ugly heads. So it's important just to think long term. If there is a term that you wouldn't be comfortable with if you're there for 10 years or 20 years, you should give it some thought as to whether you'd be comfortable with it for 2 years plus whatever time it would happen after you heard that you were not going to relocate the franchise. Most importantly, environmental issues. This is really important for buyers. Buyers, when they're purchasing property or they're leasing property, after you sign the agreement, you want 30 days, maybe 60 days to have a due diligence period related to environmental assessment. Okay, and every property is different. There might be state issues, there might be federal issues related to CERCLA for hazardous materials. Okay, and if there's hazardous materials in the ground or in the groundwater, it might be coming from your dealership, from a past use, it might be coming from a nearby location. We've seen issues with plumes of hazardous materials coming from across a highway from some lot that was used as a factory for industrial purposes, and that was basically slowing down the deal. So you want to at the very least have an initial assessment, right? A phase 1 assessment. Okay, so you want to have that right. The buyer pays for that. But then you want to have contingencies built in about what happens from there. Obviously, if nothing comes up, then it's great. But if something comes up, you want to say, all right, we have to go to a phase 2 assessment. Who pays for that? Okay? Or if we're going to do a phase 2 assessment, can I as a buyer walk away and get my deposit back? Right? These are things you have to think about and deal with beforehand, before you sign the agreement. Very often, a lot of the environmental costs, whether it be phase 2s or remediation, are shared. So you want to set those terms in advance. Franchise approval, real quickly. There are provisions that are important for sellers. Okay, so the sellers want to set a deadline for when to get approval. They don't want to wait forever for Ford or GM or Toyota or whomever to decide that the buyer is going to be approved or not approved. All right, so it could be 90 days, it could be 120 days, whatever is reasonable. You also have to look in your state. I know within Ohio, typically the franchisor has 30 days to either approve or disapprove. But what ends up happening is they'll disapprove because they say they don't have enough information. So realistically, even in Ohio, you want to set up maybe 90 days or 120 days to get the closing done. All right, and if it doesn't happen, then everyone walks away. The buyer gets their deposit back. But as a seller, you also want to put in terms that hold the buyer accountable to their actions during that process. Okay, so are they necessarily responding timely? Okay, so you want to set up, okay, after the deal is signed, you want to be able to, as the buyer, hand over the application within 10 days, okay? And you also want to respond within 10 days to any request for information. Okay, so that way you have objective measures that hold the buyer accountable, and so if anything comes up, the seller may have the right then to terminate the agreement and keep the deposit. That's something that sellers like, and obviously buyers don't. So, provisions for buyers that they want. Facility upgrades. If you're going to get a facility upgrade or you're going to relocate, you want to put that in the franchise approval language to say that you're going to, you need to get approved, subject to a standard dealer sales and service agreement, as well as, the upgrade of the facility, the relocation of the facility. If you're a seller, you want to nail down those specific terms. When you're talking about a facility upgrade, is it just to the showroom? Is it to the service area? Identify those areas potentially, or identify the budget. Up to $500,000, up to $1.2 million. If it's relocation, identify the specific address if it's been identified already, or identify a zip code. So it's just something, once again, that kind of keeps things moving, and either the deal will happen or it won't. OEM rights of first refusal. Ohio law doesn't address rights of first refusals on behalf of franchisors, so you're really kind of stuck with trying to make the agreement palatable only to the actual buyer, which is a challenge. Very often you can, if there's multiple stores, if there's real estate that's tied to this, there might be situations in which the factory doesn't want to exercise the right of first refusal on that. So if it benefits the buyer, that certainly is helpful. If the buyer wants a consulting agreement for the seller for 12 months or 24 months, maybe GM or whoever the franchisor is doesn't want to have that. But it's important that you put those terms there, and you also state that if there is any exercise of the right of first refusal, that the right of first refusal has to accept every term in the agreement. Poison pills, a lot of people try to get fancy. They try and say, okay, I'm going to put $1 million poison pill. So the buyer gets paid $1 million if he doesn't get this deal. That's going to get thrown out in a court, state court or federal court or wherever, just because it's not reasonable. All right? So if it's one thing to say $1 million, it's another thing to say, the buyer has to get reimbursed for costs of legal services from negotiating the deal, or cost of due diligence, financial due diligence with your accountant, or environmental assessment, upwards of $50,000 or $100,000. That's reasonable. And that will be part of the elements of the agreement that will either make it palatable or not palatable to the franchisor. And also keep in mind, it's not just about the franchisor, but who they're going to assign the deal to. Okay, because I've been on that end as well. I've represented dealers who were offered through GM, for instance, to take over a transaction. Okay, so we had a situation like that in Colorado. And very often the deal itself might not be palatable to that dealer. Okay, so you have to think, all right, who are the people who are going to be in the market who might want to take this deal? And that requires a little bit of foresight and advanced thinking, but it's something that is definitely a factor. So even if you don't have terms that will thwart off a right of first refusal, there's a good likelihood that that right might not be exercised if there aren't dealers out there willing to take on that deal. Okay, last but not least, I appreciate you guys listening. I know it's after lunch, but I want to talk about closing conditions, right? So you've gotten to the closing, everyone's really happy, everyone's rushing around to get the deal done. You've set a closing date, okay, you've gotten franchise approval. There's still things that logistically might hold up the actual closing. Okay, one of those, most important thing is a closing statement and any parts or vehicle inventories and the calculation of of the value of the sale of those vehicles and the parts and accessories. Okay, so we'll have people who are going to be putting those numbers together. They may not be the owner, but they may be people kind of working off to the side, and there's going to be negotiations, and like human nature, things take a long time to get done. And maybe you're found, even if you started 2 days before closing, maybe there's a potential that you're still figuring out the value of the new vehicles that are being sold up to 1 p.m. the day of the closing. That can happen. So it's just important to make sure you coordinate all those individuals and try and get that part of the process done as quickly as possible, as well as accurately. Floor plan payoff. We've seen situations where someone forgot to notify the floor plan provider for the seller, and the day of the closing, we're saying, okay, where's the payoff letter? And the seller said, what payoff letter? I thought we took care of that. They make some phone calls and realize it wasn't taken care of, and we had to wait 3-4 hours to get that payoff letter. Meanwhile, everything else was done, but it basically pushes everything further away in terms of closing. Sales tax escrow. Okay, in New York as well as other states, the buyer is liable for any unmet sales tax liability for the seller. But there's an opportunity to not be liable if you set up an escrow, okay, that is approved by the state tax department. Okay, so very often the tax department is, obviously because they're part of the government, they are on their own schedule, and you may not get a notification as to how much escrow you should reserve in the purchase price. Okay, so this escrow, once again, when the seller gets their money, you're holding back a portion of that in case there's any sales tax liability that the seller hasn't met, right? So instead of waiting to get a number, the buyer and the seller can come up with a reasonable number, and estimate what that escrow amount will be. And then once the buyer and seller get proof that that liability has been satisfied, the escrow gets released. Document execution, once again, try and get everyone who's signing present physically, especially when documents need to be re-executed or you need to execute additional agreements and assurances. And then last but not least, wire transfers. Okay, if you are the buyer and you're sending over things via wire transfer, please know when your bank when the bank's cut off for that wire transfer. Because very often there was the assumption that banks would effectively, thank you, that banks would effectively be open until 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. But very often some of these banks, if they're smaller banks in particular, you guys are familiar with, I think it was like Fifth Third. There are Fifth Thirds around here? Okay, yeah, Fifth Thirds, I think at one point they had like a 2 o'clock close for wire transfers. Some banks like JP Morgan, they might have 5, or you might have a good relationship with someone and they say, hey, I'll let you go till 6, but some banks don't. And then that just delays the payment and the closing to another day. Well, thanks again, I really appreciate it. If you need to contact us, you have any questions, any more information you'd like, feel free to contact me, or you can take my card later on. Just one real quick notice, this isn't necessarily to the dealers out here, but obviously to the Brady Ware team as well. There is a new dealership brokerage that's being set up called Lab Nation. It's a situation where we're going to have a lot of the accountants and attorneys that typically work with dealers who will be acting as brokers as well. And it's a situation where you'll probably, as a seller, get access to more buyers. As a buyer, you'll get access to more selling opportunities, because very often these folks know about these deals well in advance of any other kind of brokers and broker agents. So just something to mention, and thanks again.